How many of y'all planted something in your garden? Now, what are you going to plant this year in your garden? Tomatoes? Peppers. I like peppers. I like them jalapeno peppers, you know. What else are you going to plant? Peas? Cabbage growing already? You know, when you think about a garden, you think about all the work that goes into the garden, about how you have to break the ground, till the ground up. So I guess a lot of people plant it flat, but I grew up where you made a row, so you planted it on rows. I still row up a garden when I do it, if I have to do it with a hoe. And I'll have, you know, like string beans and squash and that kind of thing. And then you're supposed to get out there and hoe the garden, right? I try to hoe the garden some, but a lot of times I hoe with what they call Roundup. You know what I mean? Makes it a lot better. And so then you work in the garden and you sweat in the garden and then finally you get to eat, right? After a period of time, you begin to eat out of the garden, and that's really good stuff, right? Fresh green beans or snap beans and butter beans and peas and fried okra. You know, it's just a really good time, and we'll talk a little bit more about food, and we'll go home and we'll eat. Well, there's a big difference in the garden that we plant and the garden that God planted. And that's what we're looking at tonight. The garden work that we have to do today, Adam didn't have to do that to begin with. So if you will, look with me in Genesis chapter 2. We're talking about man and what's going on with man. Last week we looked at the creation of man, and you know, I could preach all this in one sermon, but we'd be here about 2 hours because it's a lot to it, so I'm breaking it up into small sermons. And you look at chapter 2, verse 8, and you'll see the Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there He put the man whom He had formed. There's a couple of things in that verse. And as we begin to build, I want us to see a few things. Man was given sovereignty over the entire created world. And the world was created in 7 solar days, or 6 days, and then the 7th day. There were solar days, 24-hour days. And so that's how He made the world. Man is mentioned in chapter 1, but does not become center stage of the story until you get to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, you get a more detailed event of what happened in chapter 1, and man becomes center stage, and he stays center stage in Genesis all the way to the end of the book of Genesis. It's about God's relationship with man. And so we begin to get the patriotic story. Man is mentioned in the garden, and in this garden there are certain things that we've already been taught about in chapter 1. The world is being watered in chapter 1 not by rain, not by what we would consider a mist, but what is believed to be, and the wording talks about geysers that are going up from the ground. And you're going to see more of that as we go into the study tonight. That the geysers, it was a high water table, so there was a lot of volcanic activity after the creation of the world, and there's water being shot into the sky, and it's so thick that it looks like a mist that's falling from the sky, and it covers the ground, and there you have a lush garden, more like a rainforest than anything else. And in the midst of this situation, God decides He's going to create something special and something unique, and He creates His own garden. How big is your garden? How many of y'all have a 4-acre garden? Bigger than that, huh? Danny, how big is your garden? About 1/4 of an acre. You know, if you have an acre garden, that's a big garden, isn't it? But as we look into God's garden, it covers a vast expanse of ground. It is a huge garden. And man could never plant that type of garden, especially in those days. And so we begin to see that God is beginning to form a special relationship with man. He creates a garden, He plants a garden, He puts the trees in the garden, and He decides that this is where He wants to put man. And that's what He did. He put man. So you begin to look again with me in verse 8. The Lord planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there He put the man whom He had formed. The man is singular man, the only man He put there. Out of the ground, the God made every tree grow that was pleasant to the sight. So what we're looking at, we understand that man has been created. Now we're going to see the location of man. Where did God put man? God planted that garden in verse 8 of chapter 2, and man's there by himself, but it's an unusual type of garden. There are scriptures in the Bible, you can especially go to Ezekiel, and I have it up there, Ezekiel chapter 28. You begin with about verse 12, and it's talking about the king of Tyre, and really the king of Tyre is a reference to Satan. And so God is talking to Satan in Ezekiel chapter 28. And He talks about all the things in the garden that's there, and He talks about the garden being on, now get this, a high hill. And every time I go by Danny and Miss Melanie's garden, you know, I'm in the road, you kind of have to look up to your garden. I kind of think about the Garden of Eden being on a high hill. And that's unusual. Most of the time you want the bottoms that are fertile, right, around the creeks and the rivers. And we know they're rivers because we read about the rivers in the Scripture. So they're river bottoms. There'd be water flowing. It would bring the natural flow of dirt. And there would be fertile land. And that's where you want to place your best crops. But here, He builds it on a mountaintop. And there's some things that He does as He begins to build this garden. Number one, and I want you to kind of follow along with me, when you look in Ezekiel chapter 31 at the trees, again a reference and about God talking to the guy that's there who would be Satan, and he's talking about all the precious metals that are there in these passages, and he also talks about the trees that are there. But there's something unique here that I find somewhat catches my attention, is that it says that He put trees in verse 9, every tree grow that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. What does that tell us? That there are some trees that are created that may not look what? Pleasant. And there are some trees that do not produce what? Fruit. So He takes what is pleasant to the sight, and when I think about pleasant to the sight, y'all know I like Hallmark movies. I've made that statement several times, right? And so you start a Hallmark movie, especially if it's about autumn, and they go up into Vermont and Maine, and they have these beautiful scenes of trees that are turning colors. And they're just beautiful. Well, that's the picture that I want you to see. God is putting trees in His special garden that are pleasant to look at, that brings God a delight. And He puts not only the trees that are beautiful, that have the beautiful colored leaves, I would suggest to you, but also He puts there those that have the fruit that is fitting to eat. So here we are talking about fruit trees. What is your favorite fruit tree? Apple tree. What other kind of fruit tree is there? Peach and pear. Fig tree. Come on, we're going to name a lot of trees. Plum trees. Grape. What else? Cherry trees. Pomegranates. Orange trees. Tangerines, satsumas, whatever you want to call them. What else? crab apple. If you're from somewhere besides Mississippi, there's pecans. Right? And there's almonds and dates. Pecan. I said pecan, but he said it right. Pecan. You see, there is a multitude of trees, and there are trees that that Adam and Eve will be able to eat off of, and there's a tremendous amount of them, so they need absolutely nothing. And so when you think about the Garden of Eden, you think about how God is blessing the man that He's putting in this garden. There is nothing that man needs that's not there. There is nothing that will not be beautiful to the man's sight that is not there. Everything in the garden is the very best that man would consider beautiful and that man would be able to eat of the fruit of the tree. Everything is there. And remember this, at this point in time, there are no thorns nor thistles. There's no weeds because it has not rained as of yet. It said that God planted the trees. How do trees get planted in the wilderness? Ma'am? The wind. Now, birds will carry some seeds, but the wind carries the majority of seeds, right? And so for a tree, if an oak tree is going to be blown 10 miles, a storm will come along, the wind will take the acorns or maybe and cause the water to fall, and the seeds are spread by the forces of nature. What is happening at this time is there are no forces of nature. There's no rain. There's no hydraulic system. Y'all know what a hydraulic system is? If Sam was here, he'd know. All these engineers know, right? It's the movement of water. Water is evaporated. The wind helps force the water up. The water forms clouds. Clouds do what? And the rain condenses. It falls to the ground, and it's a cycle. And it causes the weather patterns that we have. So when you look at the Garden of Eden, it's on top of a mountain, there are no weather patterns, and there's plenty of water there for the garden. So we see that it's pleasant to the sight, we see that it's good for food, and we see that there are two individual trees that are noted to be there. And the first one is called the tree of life. What's important about the tree of life is this, that it was open to man to eat of it. Man could eat freely of the tree of life. And as long as man eats of the tree of life, he will never what? Die. Because the tree is in the garden and man is in the garden, it tells us that man was created to live forever. He could freely partake of the tree of life. Then there is a second tree, and it is the tree of what? Knowledge of good and evil. And of this tree they cannot eat. Because everything up to this point has been what? Good. There's nothing bad in the world. God created everything, and as He looks at His creation, every time He looks, He says, and it was good. Could they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? The answer is yes, because they did. If they ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, would it kill them? Eventually. It would cause the death. But what about immediately? Was it poison? Would it cause them to fall over immediately dead? No, so it was also what? Good to eat. But there was a prohibition put there to test man. Would man be obedient to God? Man without sin and man without a sin nature was given a test. And the test is a very simple test. It is pass or fail. Don't you hate those tests? I mean, you either pass it or you fail it. You don't get a 60 or 70 or 80 or 90. You get an A or a F. Which is most fun? Have you had death? You're supposed to say no. No, that's right. Tell the truth. And so here's the test. God created the garden. The scriptures tell us that it's on the mountain, that it's got all the beautiful gold and precious stones there. It is somewhat of a picture. If you look at the precious stone and the gold that is good, it is a picture of heaven. Everything they could want is there. And the most important thing that they need is God's presence. And God meets with them daily. And He walks with them. Don't you like that song? And He talks with them. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Look with me in Genesis chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. Something you need to see. Then the Lord said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, that had eaten from the tree, to know good and evil, and now lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live for how long? Forever. Even though he now has the knowledge between good and evil, and he has disobeyed God, as long as he's able to partake of the tree of life, he will be able to live forever in that state of sinfulness. And that would be a terrible penalty for man. And so God says we can't let that happen. Therefore, verse 23, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. There is part of the curse, to work. But here's what I want you to see. So he drove out the man. Man did not want to leave the Garden of Eden. Man had it good even though he was in a sinful state. He was there with everything he needed. He had plenty to eat. He had a beautiful place to look at. He had everything taken care of him. He could still live in the garden, and he knew that God was coming by every day, so man was satisfied. But God said, man cannot be satisfied. Man has sinned against me, and so we will drive him out of the garden, and they did, and they being the Trinity, and they put the angel with the flaming sword at the entrance of the gate of the garden. And from that point on, man began to die. So, there's the garden. We see the trees. They're pleasant, they're good, it's everything they need. Then you come, go to the next slide, then you come to the garden rivers. This is just amazing to me. Everything's kind of different if you read it. Because it says that the rivers started in the garden. And the garden's on top of a mountain. Well, that makes good sense, right? We see springs on top of hills that run down into little streams or to creeks, to brooks, and then into rivers, and then from one river into a bigger river, and maybe even into a bigger river, and then they pile up and flow into the ocean or sea or the Gulf. It's not like that. Here's what you have. This one river, which is flowing with water, because the word Eden means well-watered. It is a place that is well-watered, that now the water is flowing off the mountain, and it begins to divide because there's so much water, and this one river becomes 4 rivers, and they go in 4 different directions. Highly unusual in the world of hydraulics. It's just backwards. And we look at the Mississippi River and we get a great picture of how hydraulics work today. There are many, many different rivers that run into the Mississippi River that flows. It takes many rivers to make the one great river. But here, the one great river becomes smaller rivers. And so it flows out of the well water place, and then we get the names. Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Now, you may pronounce them another way, but that's the way I pronounce them. And so here are these rivers, and it kind of gives us boundaries about the land, and it shows us where people are going to live in the future. And so people would say it kind of gives us an indication of where the Garden of Eden was located. But the truth of the matter is, it does not. Because something happens that changes all this. There are two great events that change the way things are happening. Number one, we know that the rivers over there do not flow from one mountain into a bunch of different rivers. It has become a different type of world. And so what we begin to understand is this, that at the flood, everything changed. Now we have rain, and we have the modern day weather forecast that we have. We have hurricanes and storms, and now we have weather patterns, and now we have rivers that look like our rivers today. We also know that at some point after the flood, and we'll get to that one day, that the continents shifted. Remember last week I told you could take a globe and look at it, and if you could push them with your hands, all the land masses line up perfectly. There was one big land mass. But sometime around the Tower of Babel, God separated man, and He also separated the continents, and there was a great shift of the land. And so now we have no idea where the Garden of Eden was located. Well, there's rivers there. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers are still there, Brother Andy, but you know what? They wasn't named that until later. They didn't have that name since the beginning of time as we know it. So we don't know where the Garden of Eden is located, in a sense. But when you look at the location of man, he's in the garden and he's working. And the garden is a beautiful place with everything he needs, and he's meeting with God every single day. Then we now know where the garden is located. It's located in heaven. Because one day, when this world is over, and we close our eyes in death, we will go to heaven, where every need we have is met. And everything there is beautiful, where there are streets of gold and gates of pearl. And every day we look upon the face of Christ, who is the tree of life that is in the midst of heaven. That's the location of man. Man is located at the Garden of Eden. And we're going to stop right there, because we're going to see woman next week. And it takes a lot of time to talk about I'm really careful. All right?